Welcome once again to a special programme about the war in Ukraine. Over the next hour, we'll be attempting to answer your questions about the war with defence and security analyst Professor Michael Clarke. Well, fierce fighting continues in the Donbass region in the east of Ukraine. Russia has told Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk to surrender tomorrow morning, calling their resistance senseless. The last bridge between the city and Ukrainian-held territory has apparently been destroyed by Russian forces, but Ukraine's troops continue to hold out. Well, as I say, Professor Michael Clarke joins me in the studio. Welcome once again. Michael, we'll crack on with the questions. We've had so many of them during the course of today, and the first question concerns that situation, of course, in the Donbass. Christian asked, do you think we are coming to the end game, and the end game in Russia's favour?
No. It's got a fair way to go yet. I mean, if the Russians keep up this momentum, this slow, gradual, grinding momentum, then they probably will take most of the Donbass eventually. But the word is eventually. They haven't taken Severodonetsk yet, which is the capital of Luhansk, which is the smaller of the two oblasts, the two areas of the Donbass region. And the Ukrainians are making them pay to take Severodonetsk. Everyone is saying, reporters are out there and they're saying this is the critical moment. Well, it's not. Severodonetsk is not the strategically important city. The two strategically important cities are Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, further in the west. Those have to be defended, and the Ukrainians at the moment are fighting in Severodonetsk to make the Russians pay a price before they pull back, I think, first of all to Lysychansk on the other side of the river, because the Russians have still got to cross the river, the Seversky Donets River. They've still got to cross that river in force, and they haven't yet. They've made a real mess of it twice. And the Ukrainians will have time to fall back on their real strategic objective, which are the two cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk.
Well, what about this bridge reportedly being destroyed? Does that make that plan
bridges? Yeah, I mean, there are several bridges, and a lot of them have been destroyed and partially rebuilt. It doesn't mean that the Ukrainians are trapped. It may mean that they can't bring their equipment with them, but they can always get troops over a river. They can get them over in boats. They can get them over on makeshift bridges. They can throw military bridges over a river, create pontoon bridges. It's always vulnerable if you do that. But this doesn't stop the troops escaping. It may mean that they can't take their heavy equipment with them, in which case they would disable it and then leave.
Well, Michael, you mentioned they're making the Russians pay a heavy price, but our next question now asks, I suppose, but at what price for the Ukrainian forces? This one asks, how long can Ukraine continue to lose troops
that's the Pavlograd
current
bridge.
Rate? There it is.
That was the main Pavlograd bridge that went down about 3 weeks ago, and that was the biggest bridge, the best bridge, and that was down, but they've worked their way around it. Pavlograd was the main one, but it doesn't matter. OK, but in terms of the troop losses by Ukrainians, President Zelensky says they're losing, 1 to 200 a day? 3,000 a month. They are, and they can't sustain that for very long, but so are the Russians. The Russian losses seem to be about the same level. I mean, Russian losses were much higher than Ukrainian losses in the other battles of Kiev and Kharkiv and so on. Now that this is a real Second World War-style toe-to-toe match in the Donbass, they're fighting in a sort of almost 1940s, 50s way. Their losses are about equal.
In the streets, block by block?
Absolutely, block by block, hand to hand. It's about as dreadful as you can ever imagine from a soldier's point of view. And their losses are about the same. Neither of them can sustain 3,000 a month for very much longer. So there will be a pause. There will be a pause while both sides take a breath. And
can I just ask you, does that manner of fighting, does that negate the Russian advantage when it comes to artillery and long range? Because you can't really attack the other side if they're cheek by jowl with yours.
No, that's right. I mean, one of the reasons that the Ukrainians have stayed toe-to-toe with the Russians is to stop them using their artillery. But what the Russians have been doing is flattening everything in front of them, and then they walk in over the rubble. I mean, the one thing the Russians are good at, which they always were, and they've proven that they haven't got anything else in their locker than this, really, is to flatten urban areas and then, as it were, invade the rubble. And if another side, in this case the Ukrainians, are prepared to fight in the rubble, and the Ukrainian army is good enough to do that, then even that's not straightforward. So they can keep destroying areas, but their progress is extremely slow, extremely slow. We all expected them to be even for Russians, we expect them to be a lot quicker than they've been. I mean, some of them, sometimes they're making less than a kilometre a day, and some days not even that, and some days they're getting pushed back. And they're drawing more and more troops into Severodonetsk, into this particular battle, and they're getting thinner and thinner in the north in Kharkiv, in the south in Kherson.
Well, that's the next question I wanted to ask ask you about. So moving on then to the south, as you mentioned there, Kherson. Nick wants to know, will Ukraine manage to finally break through and retake Kherson? Because it seems the Russians have never been able to entirely pacify it.
They haven't. And there's a lot of resistance in Kherson and Melitopol, a lot of what the Russians will call terrorism now against Russian troops and collaborators and so on. It's pretty ugly stuff. And it's breaking out in the streets of Kherson, the streets of Melitopol. The Ukrainians say that they think they are going to retake Kherson. I mean, I think they might be a bit optimistic about that. But they have launched a pretty big offensive across a 50-mile front, and they've crossed the Inhulets River. Again, crossing rivers is really important in military terms. They've crossed the Inhulets River to the north-west of Kherson, and they're trying to get round the back of Russian troops in Kherson while they also attack them from the west. So they're trying a two-pronged attack against Kherson. And what they're finding is that the Russians are now pretty thin in Kherson because they've taken a lot of troops away for this Donbass offensive. And I don't know if the Ukrainians are being too optimistic about this, because even having crossed the Inhulets River, they're still 40 miles away from the city. But unlike the Russians, more like Western forces, the Ukrainians make rapid progress. They move quickly and they move efficiently when they do move. So we'll see. I mean, I think in the next couple of weeks, we'll find out if this offensive against Kherson, to retake Kherson, is going to be a success or not.
OK, well, let's stay in the south, because our next question follows on from that situation. Louis wants to know, do you think Mykolaiv and Odessa are the next targets after Donbass or Kharkiv and Dnipro? So if Donbass is relatively secured by Russia, where would it turn its sights next?
I think the answer to Lewis is yes, exactly. Mykolaiv and Odessa are more important strategic targets for the Russians, because to take Odessa would landlock Ukraine. It would make Ukraine a landlocked country. I mean, the Russians, remember, they've already got Mariupol. They control the Sea of Azov. They've got Berdyansk, those ports on the other side of Crimea, to the east of Crimea. The big port to the west of Crimea, of course, is Odessa. And that's the third city. It's Ukraine's third city. So, yes, they need to take Mykolaiv, because Mykolaiv is the gateway to Odessa, even though it's 80 miles away. So they've got to take Mykolaiv, and then they've got to cover the 80 miles to Odessa. And those are big objectives. They've completely failed once. They've been thrown back from Mykolaiv, which is why they're now struggling to hold on to Kherson, it seems. But if they could then release the troops in the Donbass, give them a break, and then redeploy them to this area, then I'm sure their next strategic objective would be to complete this land bridge all the way across southern Ukraine.
But that's quite a big if, isn't it? If they take the Donbass and redeploy the troops, which has risks in itself, in that you've got to occupy territory, and the rest and deployment takes a long time.
It does. And that's why, I mean, I think, people keep asking me about what do I think is going to happen, and I guess we're going to talk about it a bit later on maybe, but the Ukrainians have shown they can fight the Russians to a standstill more or less anywhere in Ukraine. What they can't obviously do is kick them out, take back the territory that they've lost. They're trying, but that's a different sort of objective. And so I think that I think the Ukrainians will be pretty successful at defending Odessa, even if the Russians can redeploy from the Donbass in, say, 2 months' time. I think they will, but we will see. Warfare is more unpredictable than sport.
Indeed. OK, a couple of questions coming up about the air battles. And Ken wants to know, why aren't Ukrainian forces attacking Russia from the air? Because in the past, in these programmes, we've discussed how there are still Ukrainian Air Force planes in the air.
They've got about half of their Air Force left. They started with about 120 combat aircraft. They seem to have about 50 or so left. They're getting some more, the MiG-29s, but the MiG-29s are an air combat aircraft for fighting against other aircraft. They're not really a ground attack aircraft. The Su-25s are the one that are ground attack, and so to attack Russian forces from the air, they need more Su-25s, and they are getting some of those. But remember, they're also attacking the Russians from the air with drones. So the Bayraktar drone, this Turkish drone, which costs 1/20th of the cost of an American or a British drone. I mean, they're cheap and cheerful, but they work. And the point about Bayraktars is it's not that they're any great technological breakthrough, just that you can have lots of them. And if you can have lots of them, you can obliterate whatever's on the ground, even if you lose half of them. So the Bayraktar drones have been extremely successful. They've got lots of other sorts of drones, even tiny ones, or little copters, that drop a grenade. And on a little group of soldiers who don't even hear it, drops a grenade. And there's any amount of footage that shows exactly that happening. So they are attacking them from the air. But, Russian forces have got their own air defence. The Ukrainians are losing aircraft. And they do need, they do need to rework their air force if they're going to stay in this war over the next months and into next year.
Well, Mark asked the other side of the coin now about Russian forces in the air. Why has Russia not committed more of its air force to the war for both bombing and ground attack missions? Presumably, they've got a huge air force. We mentioned that from the start of the campaign.
They have, yeah. They're active. Their combat air power is not much more, to be honest, than about 800 aircraft. It's not the 3,000 or 4,000 that are there on paper, or even 5,000 by some estimates. But it's more like up to 1,000, and it's more likely to be, by some estimates, as low as 750, 800, 850. However, and they committed about 230, 240 to this operation at the beginning. They've clearly committed more than that now. Their problem is not the number of airframes they've got available, it's the ability of their pilots and their command system to do air-ground coordination. So even with more aircraft, they find it difficult, actually, to bomb things on the ground. And they're lousy, really lousy at bombing moving targets. And it's not because they can't aim as they work it, but the idea of getting moving targets is that, first of all, you've got to detect the movement, then you've got to see the target, get somebody back at base to understand there's an aircraft within 30 miles, get that aircraft over the target before it disappears. Now, Western air forces are very good at that.
Is that down to humans or technology?
It's both. It's training. They've got the technologies, but they haven't trained for it. They've done so little air-ground support exercises, it seems, in the past. And so they have a command problem, is that although they can bomb fixed targets, the way anybody can bomb fixed targets, reasonably accurately, they haven't got many precision-guided weapons. The JDAMs, these are the bombs, the Joint Attack Demolition munitions, which are bombs that can be directed. They free fall, but they can be directed left or right and so on. They haven't got many of those, so they drop dumb bombs, Second World War bombs, that they go wherever they go according to how the pilot releases them. So they drop a lot of those, but they still can't use really accurate weaponry to get onto a target within a couple of minutes of discovering that it's moving along a road and you want to get it. And the Ukrainians are very good at doing that.
Well, let's talk about those targets that the Ukrainians are hitting, because another question from Mark, not sure if it's the same one, but Mark asks, what happened to the Russian T2 tanks? We heard so much about. Well, tell us, it's much feared T2. What's happened? What's it doing?
Terminator.
Are they there?
Yeah, it's not actually a tank. It's a BMP. It's called a BMP-2, the Terminator 2. It's a tank insofar as it's on a tank chassis. It's on a T-72 standard tank chassis. And, it's often said that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. Mm-hmm. Well, this is an armoured fighting vehicle designed by a committee. They've taken a tank chassis and they've piled onto it all of the weapons that soldiers say they want. So there it is. It's got two 30mm cannons. It's got 4 rocket launchers. At the back, it's got 2 grenade launchers. It's got a heavy machine gun. It's got smoke grenade launchers. It's got everything on it. And the crew is all inside doing all this remotely. Now, I've never been inside one of these things. Very few people have. I can't imagine what it's like inside, because the amount of transmission belts, the amount of ammunition that must be going backwards and forwards while these things are available is staggering. The Russians have been boasting about this for a long time. They had them available at the May Day parade, I think it was in 2018, and it broke down. And they haven't been at the May Day parades until this year. And this year they were due to have 3, and only 2 turned up. So we think that one of those broke down as well. They've only got 1 troop of these Terminator 2s, these BMPs, and that troop has been sent to Severodonetsk, and that is either 8 or 10. So we think, the MOD thinks it's only 8. Others have said it's probably 10. But at most, they've got 10 of these things. They've sent them to Severodonetsk. We haven't yet heard how they're getting on. But I suspect it's a camel. I suspect it's as vulnerable as any other T-72, even though it's got all this weaponry piled on top of it.
So you think some of them have been knocked out, some of them have probably broken down?
I'm very interested to hear how they've been getting on. They've been there now for over 2 weeks. They haven't turned the battle, that's for sure.
OK. Last question for this section, and interesting one, this from M. Why is there so little, incredibly little, frontline combat footage? One might almost be tempted to wonder if it's all made up. Well, that bit, no, it's not but there is that question: why is there so incredibly little frontline combat footage? Why isn't it emerging? And in an age of social media, who's controlling it?
Oh, Dermot, there is, and Sky's got lots of this stuff, and it doesn't use it for reasons of propriety and decency. And we see it, and those of us who are in this analysis business, we see it all the time. I'm looking at this stuff all the time on Twitter, and not on YouTube particularly, but other sources, and a lot of it's horrible. It's horrible. So, yes, there is plenty of footage. It's not that this is being invented in some way or that there isn't a lot of material. There's masses of material, and a lot of it is just too nasty to want to spread around. And so what we see is, what's available and what the news channels choose to put out. But, I mean, you've seen some of the stuff as well. It's
well, there is that argument, though, isn't there, that in a way it kind of sanitises warfare, as you say. It's brutal, it's horrible.
Yeah. Do you know the person who said that most was Norman Schwarzkopf? Remember storming Normandy from the Gulf War of 1991? And he said, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's something like, war is ultimately obscene. It is obscene and disgusting when you're in it. And it is. I mean, warfare brings out some of the best of human nature and a great deal of the worst. And, I mean, anybody who's been in firefights, real close firefights, not remote artillery duels or whatever, anyone who's been in firefights, will never, ever forget it and will always be marked by the experience. And even, artillery. People look, you see films and people sort of duck down to their foxholes and explosions go on. I mean, if an artillery shell lands, anything within about 50 yards, the shrapnel flies all over the place. And so quite a lot of people will be injured or killed within about 50 yards of one shell landing. They say, sitting under an artillery barrage is one of the most frightening things you could ever do because of the sheer extent of the shrapnel.
The reality of warfare, and it's certainly not made up. We're taking a break. You're watching Sky News. Coming up, we're going to be discussing then Vladimir Putin's aims and what victory could now be looking like for the Russian president. Welcome back. We're going to turn now to Vladimir Putin and what his objectives may be now after initially attempting, you remember, to seize the capital, Kiev, in the early days of the war. What does victory perhaps now look like for the Russian president? Michael Clarke, as you know, is here answering those questions. And let's kick off with this one from Ian, which is the state which has been asked an awful lot about of Vladimir Putin's health. Michael, do we know? I mean, is he really ill or is this just wishful thinking? The thought being that, he's on his way out, he's 69 and he's launched this war now because it could be his last hurrah.
Well, he still can. Yes, on the 7th of October, he'll be 70. That's his birthday, the 7th of October. And he is known to hit the Botox quite heavily. I always say that he's trying to embalm himself while he's still alive. He does take a lot of Botox. He moves around with doctors. There's known to be a little team of doctors who are never far away, and it's said that he leaves meetings at frequent intervals to go and consult with somebody. I suspect that he's only a hypochondriac, to be honest. It's often said, look, has he got cancer? He's got pancreatic cancer. He's got Parkinson's disease. When you see him in these clips that we're seeing increasingly frequently now that COVID is over and he's now coming out of the shadows, as it were, where he's been for over 2 years, and he's making it clear that he's in control, he's doing this, he's doing that. He looks all right. I've spoken to a number of people who said you cannot detect Parkinson's disease from the way he walks. You cannot detect symptoms of cancer just by looking at the photographs. So, these stories will circulate, but there's no convincing evidence. If he is ill, or becomes ill, that would be one way out for Russia to say that the president has stepped down and the war will now be prosecuted by, Nikolai Patrushev, who's every bit as nasty as he is, but at least it would be a change of face, which the West might then be able to do something with. But that's just a side possibility, really.
OK, well, let's talk now about the alliances that they've built up, namely with China. I guess Al asks, is Russia sourcing weapons and munitions from other countries, or is it purely relying on its own reserves? Is it getting anything from China and others? Yeah,
it's trying. What it most needs is components. And so a lot of Soviet equipment, a lot of old Soviet equipment and some more modern Russian equipment has been sold around the world, in the Middle East, to India, to some African countries. And the Russians are scouring their customers to try and get some of it back. if not whole weapon systems, certainly ammunition, which they're pretty short of, precision ammunition, and some of the other more specialised things. We know that they've asked China quite early on, actually, after about a month fighting, for weapons, and the Chinese have not said no, but they haven't helped either. It's believed that China has given them some help of a relatively low-level type of, not non-lethal, but things which are not directly ordnance, direct weapons. So, yes, they are trying to source mainly components in the rest of the world, and yes, they are relying on their own reserve stocks. They're dipping deep into their reserve stocks now, and so we're now seeing some of these T-62 tanks.
What are these older versions?
The older version, 1960s version, the real Cold War versions of tanks, and they are now appearing in the battle space. So, yeah, the Russians are struggling, and sanctions, of course, have had a big effect on their own armaments industry because their tank factories, the two big tank factories that they've got, are almost at a standstill for lack of components. Because they get their components basically from the West, or have done.
OK, and what about the fighting forces themselves? I mean, we've heard, particularly in the last week, about considerable numbers of conscripts being used by Russia. Bruce says, is it mainly the army composed of conscripts? In
total terms, about 50-50, which is to say that the peacetime army, which is the Russians are relying on, because officially this is still peacetime, this is a special military operation, not a war, so Putin hasn't mobilised, and the peacetime army is 280,000. And every year, around about April, there is a new conscript intake of 135. This year it was 134,500, I think it was. So, about half of 280,000 is replaced every year. So another group comes in for a 7-month training period, and over that period, about half the army leaves. So this peacetime army is in a period of transition. And 1 year conscription is no good to anybody. You spend 7 months training somebody, and then they do 5 months of work, and then they're back in the civilian sector. Now, what the Russians try to do is, during that period when somebody's conscripted, they say, look, your life as a conscript is miserable, isn't it? We know it's miserable. Actually, we make it miserable for you. Sign a contract, become a professional soldier for 2 years, and your life will improve from tomorrow. And so what they've been trying to do is bring the conscripts in, persuade them, pressurise them to sign contracts to increase the size of their army. But they haven't been terribly successful. And Putin promised at the beginning of this operation that he would not employ conscripts in the forces fighting in Ukraine. And that promise has gone by the board because there are lots of conscripts in Ukraine.
Lastly, in this section, back to the aims of the Russian forces. And Stu asks this, if Russia wins these southern regions, let me add in the eastern ones as well, will they then try for Kiev again, perhaps with chemical weapons or nukes because of a lack of ground troops? So in terms of objectives, if the Donbass is secured, the bits of the south, say they don't go for Odessa, could they go for Kiev again?
It is certainly the case that President Putin wants to eliminate Ukraine from the map as an independent state. He wants Ukrainian territory and people to be part of Russia, the way he believes, mistakenly, because he's got a very eccentric view of Russian history for the last 1,000 years. But he believes that Ukrainians are really just little Russians. That's what he used to call them, little Russians. And so that will remain his ultimate objective. It's been his objective since at least 2008, and we can look at that in the speeches he's made, the things he's said. So that's his ultimate objective. So yes, he would like to get Kiev at some point. Would he launch a chemical or a nuclear attack against Kiev? I don't know. I mean, Kiev is one of the jewels in the crown of Slavic culture. Kiev was founded in the year 482, so it's more than 1,500 years old. It's older than Moscow. Kiev is the centre of Slavic culture, which gave us Russia. Would he destroy it with a nuclear weapon? If he tried to, would the order be obeyed? We've talked about that before. I suspect not in the case of Kiev. So, no, I don't think... And chemical weapons, we have to say, are remarkably inefficient as weapons on the battlefield. They really don't work terribly well. They work only in very specific circumstances. When the British first used chemical weapons in the First World War, the Germans used gas first in 1915. When the British used gas later on in 1915, the Battle of Loos, they gassed themselves. It's very unpredictable, very unpredictable. Anyway, so yes, Kiev is still a target, but not with chemical or nuclear weapons. OK, we'll take a break now. Much more about Russia's objectives in the second half of this special programme. You're watching Sky News Tonight. Coming up, we're going to be discussing the international response to the war as President Zelensky of Ukraine makes another appeal for long-range weapons.
Welcome back to this special programme answering your questions about the war in Ukraine. We're going to turn now to the international response to the war. Professor Michael Clarke is here to answer all your questions. And here's the first one for this section. Kevin asks, if as world leaders predicted we knew Putin was going to invade Ukraine, why did the West not stockpile weapons and train the Ukrainian military ahead of the invasion? Well, I suppose to a certain extent the West did. Start that process.
Yeah. After 2014, that process began, and the British were in the lead on that with Operation Orbital, was what it was called. And we trained 22,000 Ukrainian soldiers, which were basically an officer corps. And the Americans were also heavily involved in that. What we didn't do until much later on was provide lethal weapons. We provided equipment, but there was a sort of reluctance to provoke Russia by giving lethal weapons to Ukraine. But what they did, I mean, the Ukrainians were so... they were wiped out in 2014. Their military was undermined by effectively traitors who were pro-Russian and just gave things away, gave away territory and so on. They were on the floor in 2014, which is why Putin expected them to be on the floor this time. And the Ukrainians had the good sense to go back to basics. And they said, what do we need to do? And British and American, or American and British trainers, with some help from other European and NATO nations, helped them to build up a Western force from the ground up. They did the basics. So they started from scratch and produced what is now a very Western-style force that does things in a very Western way, which is one reason, only one reason, why they're doing so well. So, yes, quite a lot was done. However, this question of if world leaders knew, well, yeah, I mean, American and British intelligence knew back in October last year that this was building up to an invasion. And they told the world in December.
Yes, that's when the intelligence started being released.
And they told the Ukrainians in October. But the fact is that the Ukrainians didn't want to believe it. I mean, they sort of half believed it, but they didn't want to. And other intelligence services were saying the opposite. And the French intelligence services in particular were actually saying, no, we're closer to Russia. We know the Russians because of the relationship between France and Russia has always been historically close. We know what they're thinking. They're not going to do this. This is all bluff and bluster. They really won't do it. And by the time we get to January this year, when the tension was really building up, there was a sort of a war of briefing. And to be honest, I mean, French intelligence seemed to have been briefing against American and British intelligence, and the Ukrainians weren't sure what to do. And I say that live on TV because A, I know it to be true, and B, the head of French intelligence was dismissed by President Macron as a result of this problem, that they got it completely and utterly wrong. So the Ukrainians, I think, were faced with a real dilemma, and there was a degree of avoidance, a degree of just denial. But it wasn't that they were unprepared, but they could have prepared better earlier, and we could have given them more lethal aid better earlier. And I know, again, for a fact, the MOD, our Ministry of Defence, was trying to give them weapons from 2014 onwards, and the Foreign Office in Downing Street just wouldn't have it.
Well,
because of
the
they were trying to make a
signals
judgment.
and the signals
they weren't necessarily wrong in saying that, but they were making a judgment. Don't give them lethal weapons.
Well, let's talk about the here and now and this continued cry from President Zelensky for these long-range weapons. And Sue asks, why are the UK and the US dragging their heels on promised long-range weapons? A promise is a promise. Are the UK and the US dragging their feet, or other countries as well?
No, I mean, the Ukrainians are getting the howitzers that they need, these howitzers with a range of 20-odd miles, these heavy howitzers. They're not getting any of ours. Ours are the AS-90s, which are very old now, and we're getting rid of them ourselves, and I think it wouldn't be sensible to send them. But there are much better howitzers, and we're re-equipping. There are much better howitzers in the business, particularly the German one, the Panzerhaubitze 2000, best in the world, and the American called the M777. And they've got apparently 90 of these M777s. They've only got a handful of the Panzerhaubitze. And they are getting some multiple launch rocket systems, but again, only a handful. The Americans are sending 7 units, but with lots of rockets. And we said we're sending 3 units with lots of rockets. Now, if the Ukrainians have only got 10 actual launch systems, I guarantee that in a month's time of fighting, they'll be lucky if they've still got 2 still operational, because the Russians will be looking for these things if they know they're there. And in battle, you lose equipment, a lot. The attrition rates, as they say, are very, very high. So it's undoubtedly the case. They are getting longer-range weapons. Promises are made, and these things are beginning to arrive, but not in anything like the numbers that they really need. They're getting plenty of howitzers, but the things that will make the difference are the multiple launch rocket systems, which have a range of about 60 or 70 miles and can have a range, if you put a missile on them, of 180 miles, not just a rocket, but a missile. Now, we're not going to give them missiles, but we're giving them rockets. But they've said, Aristov, who was the advisor to the defence ministry in Kiev, said, look, we need 60. And I think, yeah, I mean, pal, you need 60 in the first tranche, and then you're going to need 60 more after that.
They need them now. I suppose a broader question coming up now, this one just, I suppose, about the support. Are Europe doing their bit or just doing a lot of talking as usual? Well, different countries are taking different approaches.
Yeah. I mean, Europe, the European Union, and we see that, there's Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the Commission with Zelensky. I guess that's a photograph from the last couple of days. I mean, only today, she, in the European Commission, said we are recommending to the European Council, which is the heads of government, that Ukraine now be given candidate status in the EU, as an EU member. That's something the Ukrainians have really wanted, and that will be a big political message. Whether she's overreaching herself, as she has done in the past, I don't know. But the Commission is going to recommend to the governments, the 27 governments, that Ukraine be given candidate status, which means that it will get a lot more help in economic terms, which, believe me, it needs. So there is that side of it. Also, the EU is on its 6th round of sanctions and is now negotiating a 7th round of sanctions. They've got problems with Hungary, because the Hungarians, Orban in Hungary, Prime Minister Orban doesn't want to go in for a 7th round, but they're trying to negotiate that. So that sanctions have been pretty important. And individually, lots of European countries, like the Netherlands and Spain and Romania and Bulgaria, they're sending the material that they've got. And interestingly, one of the things that Britain is doing, which was only mentioned in passing about a week ago, is that the RAF has delivered, it calls thousands, it doesn't say how many, thousands of tons of munitions from one European country to Ukraine, to Poland, one assumes, where they can go. So we're not just sending our own weapons. The RAF is using its transport fleet, some of it, to move other European weapons around to help the Ukrainians.
Did not know.
So the RAF is doing something else, which, nobody seems to have picked up on.
Question here then from Lee about that, about the weapons being supplied in all their forms. How do Western arms make it to the front line intact when they have to travel across the whole of Ukraine? Don't the Russians have intelligence as to the route they take? Aren't they vulnerable?
Yeah, do you know, at the beginning of this process, I thought that would be the case. And when talking to people in the Ministry of Defence, they've said, no, they're quite relaxed about it. They said partly because there's lots of the railways system is still operational. It's a very dense railway system in Ukraine, very traditional one. It's a different gauge to everybody else's, which it's the old Soviet gauge, which isn't helpful, but never mind. So they've got a very dense railway system, so that they can move things around. The Russians find it quite hard to attack the railway system. And it can be repaired quite quickly. The road system is also, it's more sparse, but as we were saying earlier on, the Russians find it quite difficult to attack moving targets. So they are getting the stuff through, and there's a degree of subterfuge involved. And yes, the Russians are they're using their intelligence, and occasionally, as we've seen in the last week, they look as if they've scored some one or two big hits on weapon stockpiles that have come straight from the West. And they've destroyed brand new systems, quite big ones. So, I mean, the Russians are getting some success in this, but in general, most of what is being sent is finding its way reasonably quickly, a matter of several days, not 24 hours, but several days. It's finding its way to the front line.
OK, next question. This one from Buster about how far the West is prepared to go. How far are the UK and the West willing to go to secure victory in Ukraine? Well, not as far as putting boots on the ground, of course. Yeah,
and it's going to have to go a lot further than it's gone so far, in my view. I think what Buster is kind of implying, I don't know if he was thinking about this, is that if Putin gets most of the Donbass in the next couple of months, I think he will offer some sort of peace deal or some sort of truce, some sort of ceasefire arrangement. And then the Western consensus, which has been very tough so far, very determined, will tend to split. And then we'll find out how far the UK and the West is willing to go. Because then we've got to decide, a question that you and I have talked about before, both privately and on camera, is the West trying to end the war or help Ukraine really win it? If we're trying to end the war, that might happen reasonably quickly. If we're trying to help Ukraine win this war for the sake of civilized behaviour and the international order and legality and so on, then we're going to have to do a lot more than we're doing at the moment. We're going to have to be prepared to take more risks, take some hurt ourselves, both in the effect of sanctions and in the economic downside of remilitarizing what we are prepared to produce and send to Ukraine. And possibly, I think we're facing a series of thresholds between now and next year, which we'll either cross or we won't, to get a bit more directly involved, a bit more.
OK, back to the situation as it stands and how it may develop. This from Jay. If the Donbass is lost to Russia, will the West continue to arm Ukraine in order to retake the Donbass region? This is the issue you were touching on earlier about the Ukrainians' ability to fight the Russians to a standstill, but not actually...
Yeah, but not throw them out. Yeah, and that's why to actually conduct a strategic offensive, which is to actually throw the Russians out of large parts of the areas they've taken, certainly since the 24th of February, the Ukrainians need more heavy equipment. They need more equipment that can be used in the offensive. They need to rework their command structure. And they've got to bring, quite large forces of their troops who are very nicely dispersed and working very well in relatively small units, relatively. And they've got to start to bring them together for these big offensives. That will take some time, and the West would have to back that. We'd have to back it. Now, at the moment, everyone is saying in the West, we'll do whatever the Ukrainians want. If they decide to go for a ceasefire, then through gritted teeth, we would support them because they're the ones doing the fighting. If they decide, no, they're going to fight on to free up their territory, we ought to support that as well. And that's easy to say at the moment. But will it be so easy to say in August and September and October when other things are getting difficult?
What about another way of getting, I mentioned, their boots on the ground? This from Mark. Should more British veterans join in the fight with Ukraine to show a sign of strength? And there, the images we're showing, of course, are the two British veterans being sentenced to death in the breakaway Donbass region. We know of others that have been killed in the battles.
Aslin and Pinner, yeah. So Aidan Aslin, isn't it, and Sean Pinner. Yeah. I mean, point one is, real battle spaces are absolutely no place for amateurs or, willing recruits who've got no experience at all, which, these two guys were quite experienced. If anybody is determined to help, the best thing they can do is to go to the border, go to Poland or Romania and help with the background aspects. And, extra pair of hands can be very helpful. But if untrained people end up in the battle area, they'll either, they'll get hurt or killed very quickly, or they'll be just used as cannon fodder because there's not much else that they can do. Veterans are a different issue, and the government is not encouraging veterans to go, despite what the Foreign Secretary said, I think on the 27th of February. Speaking without thinking, I'm afraid. The government is not encouraging people to go because even if you're a veteran, I mean, these two guys were there for 4 years. Yeah. So they're thoroughly integrated.
They were integrated in
Absolutely. Aslin in the Marines and Pinner was in different units, I think. But both of them were proper Ukrainian soldiers who were taking Ukrainian pay and were, they happened to be foreign nationals, just as Fijians and Samoans serve in the British Army. Foreign nationals serve in the British Army perfectly legally. And they were foreign nationals serving in the Ukrainian Army. But veterans going out now to fight, to help, again, it's hard to fit them in a way that makes any military sense because even if they're quite used to military life, they're just one person with a different set of training standards and a different sort of way of doing things, different weapons they've been trained on, not the AK-47s and so on. It's unlikely that they can make that much difference. Nobody knows how many British soldiers or British individuals might be there. They think somewhere between 50 and 100. They think maybe 20 have been killed. But these are just sort of order of magnitude guesses from what we pick up. OK, Michael, for the time being, thanks. We're going to take another break. You're watching Sky News. Coming up next, we'll discuss what could happen next in Ukraine and whether an end may be some way in sight. Welcome back. We're going to end the programme now by discussing what we should expect in Ukraine in the coming weeks and months and whether an end to the war could be in sight. As you know, Professor Michael Clarke is still with me here answering your questions. This one then from Matt asking just that. The situation in Ukraine appears to be deteriorating, certainly in the east. What might the next couple of months bring? Well, if I had to guess, I mean, as I say, that war is more unpredictable than sport by and large. And I would expect that the Ukrainians will continue to fight for the Donbass fiercely, and that the Russians won't get all of the Donbass, but they'll get Luhansk and what they've got of Donetsk, and maybe a bit more of Donetsk. But I suspect that the Ukrainians will actually make gains in splitting the Russians up in Kharkiv, in the second city further north. And I think the Ukrainians really want to get Kherson back. And so I think that in the next couple of months, the Ukrainians will, as we've said, fight the Russians to a standstill in the Donbass. And the Russians might say, well, that's okay, we've got as much as we want. But they may well then find that they are losing in the south. And the Ukrainians, I think, will make some gains. However, those are all sort of tactical gains. What we're really looking at is a kind of a stalemate between both sides. And I'm sure, given the usage rates, the attrition that we're talking about, the losses of troops, I'm sure that both sides will take a pause, because that's what happens. You know, war goes in fits and starts. It has to. And I think there'll be a pause before hostilities.
A ceasefire or just a pause?
Well, I think the Russians will offer some sort of ceasefire in order to put pressure on the West. And I don't think if the Ukrainians don't accept it, I don't think we should pressure them to accept it. But I think, you know, ceasefires are one thing, but actually pauses, acknowledged pauses between both sides are another.
What about the economy, though? We talk about the situation, the war situation deteriorating. Clearly, the Ukrainian economy is in a parlous state. Can the Ukrainian economy survive, Andrew asks, considering the Mariupol steelworks are not under their control, little wheat is being farmed, and so many other money-making facilities being attacked and destroyed?
Well, the good news on agriculture is that an astonishing 90% of the crop for the next crop has been sown, because most of the agricultural areas of Ukraine have not been particularly affected by the war. But the industrial areas have, because the industrial areas are those in the east of the country, from Chernihiv right down to Mariupol, really. And the Ukrainians are looking at a drop in their GDP at the moment of 45%, which is catastrophic. And the cost of reconstruction, if the war stopped now, the cost of reconstruction is generally estimated, order of magnitude, at about $600 billion. And somebody's going to have to pay for that. And of course, the EU and the G7 are now thinking, well, the Russians should pay for it. And, you know, there is $1 trillion worth of Russian private assets in the Western world. And should they be seized in order to pay for this? There are some big issues there, not least the legal issue on what legal basis you seize it. But that's the nature of the problem. The Ukrainian economy is going to be on its knees at the end of this. Exactly as the British economy was completely bankrupt in 1945 because we devoted everything to fighting what was for us a total war. That's exactly what the Ukrainians are doing. So the fact that they've lost 45% of their GDP is only where they are now. Somebody, the Western world has got to actually help them through the war, however long it lasts. And then we've got to devise some way of helping to rebuild them. And everyone is working on, well, what can we make sure the Russians provide to rebuild some of the damage?
Well, our next question asks, how do we get to that point? And I suppose it's based on what we were discussing earlier, what you were saying there about a pause. Would Ukraine settle for the loss of the Donbass region if it brought about a lasting peace deal? And I'd add to that, how do you know it would be a lasting peace deal?
I think they wouldn't. And I'm sure they wouldn't. I mean, they might have to acquiesce in the loss of the Donbass, but they will not accept it because they don't believe that Russia bears them anything other than ill will. They do believe that Russia wants to destroy them.
So it will be a pause to regroup.
Exactly.
I mean, there have been peace deals signed before, haven't there?
Absolutely. Anything they agreed to would be on the basis that it was temporary, as far as Kiev is concerned, because they fundamentally don't trust Russia under Putin, and probably Russia under whoever comes after Putin. I think we're talking about a third generation of leadership before we can get back on terms with Russia, which I would put sometime probably in the 2030s.
Another question, as we imagine what an end to the war might look like, and this from the Russian point of view, given what Putin has promised the Russian people, given Russia's infamous history of propaganda, is it possible, even if Ukraine wins the war, that Putin will claim otherwise and say, actually, they won and achieved exactly what they set out? I mean, in a way, that's kind of a messy peace deal, isn't it? Where you can both take something away.
Yeah, it's what they will say anyway. And if President Putin says, well, we've got enough of the Donbass now. I've preserved the integrity of the Russian minorities in the Donbass who were suffering from all these Nazis in Kiev who were terrorizing them, and that's his narrative. A, the rest of the world will see that's not the case. B, the Donbass will not be peaceful any more than the land bridge will be peaceful around Kherson. I mean, the Ukrainians will keep resisting. The Russians will not be able to, as it were, go home and just leave a civilian administration there. They'll need to keep their troops there. So there'll be this grumbling war. And while that's going on, the world will be saying, oh, yes, well, this war was undertaken to tell NATO not to enlarge, and NATO's now got quite a lot bigger because Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, which are the two most important new members since 1994. And Russia is a pariah, and Russia is under sanctions for as long as you're in control, Mr. Putin. That's a great strategic victory, that is. I remain the master strategist. Everything he wanted to achieve is actually going exactly the opposite direction, and a lot of people are paying for it with their lives.
Well, Carol follows on from that then. Carol asks this, how will Russia be accepted after the war? And it's precisely the point you've been making, not just today, Michael. It is Putin is the big problem. If he's still there, how will the rest of the world regard Russia?
Yeah. Sanctions will remain for as long as Putin is there. I'm sure about that. And, Putin may not be there for so much longer. We're waiting for some sort of coup to take place. You can't guarantee whether it'll be in 3 months' time or 3 years or 5 years' time. And that poor individual is Vasily Nebenzia, who is the UN ambassador, Russia's UN ambassador. Yeah. And he has probably the worst job in the world because he's the one who has to say stupid things. He has to deny that any of this is happening. He has to pretend that all of the bombing in Mariupol was done by the Ukrainians, that they're bombing themselves, that they're killing their own women and children in order to blame the Russians. And he's a bit like Zorin, Ambassador Zorin in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Russians didn't tell him what was happening. He didn't know what was happening. And Adlai Stevenson, he suddenly said, what about this and what about this? And Zorin said, no, it's not happening, not happening. And then Adlai Stevenson went to the blackboard and he unveiled all of these photographs of the missiles and Cuba. He said, what is this, Mr. Ambassador? What is this? What is this? And he made him look really ridiculous. And Nebenzia, to me, he looks like a latter-day Zorin. I'm just waiting for the guy to defect, to be honest.
But you said there, Michael, you're expecting the coup. I mean, any time soon that Putin will be removed.
He's got nowhere to go. Russia's got nowhere to go under his leadership. And this war will get worse for Russia, even if he succeeds in the Donbass, or even if he was to succeed, as we said, in taking Odessa, which I don't think he will. The people around him are beginning to lose very heavily. And although they depend on him for their kleptocracy, I mean, Russia is a mafia state. And again, that's not my phrase, that's the phrase of most good analysts. It's become a mafia state. And so the only way that the people around him can preserve any of their privileges and wealth eventually is to remove him. Now, who will start that? We don't know, because he's also running a reign of terror, which is now every bit as bad as Stalin's reign of terror was, up to the point where Stalin died in 1953.
Michael.
So, the future, for him, the outcome is certain, the timing is uncertain.